Well, Gerard, it's very good to see you. And we normally see each other at court meetings, of course, and so on. And particularly when there's stuff about the foundation to come up. But I'm sure we'll get to that eventually further on in our conversation. Now, you were a young lad in a place that not everyone will have been to, I think, which is March in Cambridgeshire. Tell us a bit about March.
Oh, well, if you've not been there, you're quite lucky that you haven't actually. It's in the Fens. It's famous for probably only two real things, which is the prison that's now there just outside of March, where they have high-end terrorists, etc., that are kept there, and also they have the marshalling yards, which are famous for being very flat. Everywhere you used to cycle, you always seem to have the wind in your face. So it was nice to leave when I left at 18 to go to Sheffield to study, I must admit.
Yes, it is quite flat there, isn't it? I always think of March and Wisbech in the same breath, but Wisbech is a tiny bit further east, I think. Is that true? Yes,
it's about 12 miles away from March, yes. And yeah, slightly nicer buildings there, because you do have sort of Georgian buildings there. So it's a prettier town than March.
Yeah, yes, it has those nice buildings along the river, doesn't it?
Yes.
Although, I mean, typically, of course, in the 1960s, they put up a terrible shopping centre. Anyway, so you then went from there to university, and that was at Sheffield.
It was at Sheffield, yes. And I did a business studies degree, and with 2 placements. So I did 6 months with Ford's in Dagenham, where I actually worked on a job on diversity, because they were having a lot of the West Indian workers who were suitable to become supervisors and weren't actually becoming supervisors, because when they sat the English test, they struggled with some of the questions. So one of the first things I worked on was actually in the HR area, was to try and change the bias of the English test, so to make it more inclusive. So it was actually almost my first experience of dealing with diversity.
Well, that's rather a good thing to be done, wasn't it?
It was actually. It was very good, very useful. Yeah. And then the second.
No, carry on.
And then the second placement I did was with Conoco in London, and I worked there in the financial planning area, where we were actually estimating that oil prices would hit $100 a barrel, and that could justify a lot of the exploration in the North Sea. And they then sponsored me in my final year. And then subsequently, when I qualified, I had a choice of going to Conoco or Marathon Oil Company, or even I had an offer from Peat Marwick and Mitchell, but Marathon Oil Company were offering me more money, and also there was a better graduate training scheme with them. So I joined Marathon Oil Company.
Now, just going back for a moment to Ford's, I've sometimes been past there on the train, and indeed by car. But am I right in thinking now that they no longer manufacture anything there?
In Dagenham, I'm not sure. I'm not sure if they do now. It's so many years since I've been involved in that.
It was a great example of an integrated plant where they had their own power station and brought in, I think they even had their own sort of furnaces for, making the steel that they wanted and so on. But I think now it looks to me as if it's mainly just distribution and, importing perhaps on the river there.
One area that I did work in there as well, because I did 3 months also in a place called Knockdown. And this is where they actually would build the cars and then dismantle them and then send them overseas. And it was actually more efficient to actually dismantle the cars at that time than send them over complete. So quite strange, but it was called Knockdown, which I thought was quite appropriate.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. And then you were with Marathon Oil. I was saying to you earlier that we had a neighbour who lived just above us, who worked for Marathon Oil, and he lived in what I always knew as a youth as Castrol House in Marylebone Road. But I think Marathon took that over.
Yes, it was called a Marathon House, 174 Marylebone Road. It's still called Marathon House now. They've actually moved out, and it's private housing now, flats, but it still looks like an office block, but a very good location. So yes, it was a Marylebone Road.
A rather boring building, as I remember.
Exactly.
Yes, but it was Castro. That was originally Castrol who were based there, who were part of, I don't know, Burma or BP or something. Okay, so and Conoco, where were they based then? In London somewhere?
Yes, they were in Park Street, just off Park Lane.
Right.
Very central as well.
Yeah. And with Marathon, when you were working for them, where were you based then?
I did 2 years in internal audit with Marathon in London. And I think the highlight there was actually we had to do a joint venture audit of Al Jawabi Oil Company based in Tripoli. And it was the year after policewoman Fletcher had been shot dead outside the Libyan embassy. And so I volunteered to go and pick up the visas in Amsterdam to go on the trip. Because you couldn't, the embassy was closed in England. And so I went across there and I went in to collect them, paid all the money, and essentially they refused to give me the visas. And they just kept me in the dark, sitting on my own in the embassy for about 3 hours. And then this Dutch individual came along, who obviously been called by the embassy, and he said, oh, I can help you get the visas, but obviously there will be a fee involved. And in those days, you didn't have mobile phones. I had to phone my boss on a landline, and he agreed that we would pay a facilitating payment. So I stayed the night in Amsterdam and picked up the visas and went back the following day to London after we had paid a facilitating payment to this individual who was very well known by the Libyan guards. So it was obviously a little racket they were doing, and quite profitable for them.
Sounds like something out of a Ben McIntyre book.
Yes.
Quite exciting. Yes. Yes.
And Tripoli was actually really quite an interesting place. The hotel we stayed in was very modern, but the food was absolutely appalling. And on the first day, we were actually quite surprised that we wasn't going to be that bad, we thought, because they had Kerrygold butter on the table and it had just arrived out of the fridge, and they never put it in the fridge again. So after a month, the Kerrygold butter was actually just swimming in a little bowl on the table.
Oh dear. And Marathon, well, from what my neighbour, who was he himself was Tunisian, but he'd come to work for Marathon in Houston, in Texas.
Yes.
Was that where their headquarters was?
They had headquarters they had offices in Houston because most of the American oil companies did. But the main headquarters was in Findlay, Ohio, which was not the most interesting place to visit either. So.
But then you went on, and the people you worked for longest, after you did a spell in Citibank, but then you went to Heidelberg.
Yes, I was working for Citibank for 5 years in their information business, which was called Quotron, which they provided real-time financial information. And there was an advert in the Financial Times. I'm a qualified accountant, so when you're looking for a job in the old days, you'd look in the Financial Times on a Thursday to see what jobs are available. And I saw the advert for Heidelberg. I didn't really know that much about printing, but I went for the job and I met Wolfgang Gorth, who was the managing director at the time, and then George Clark, who subsequently became managing director. And the interview went extremely well. I went from a sort of hire and fire Citibank where you'd go on holiday and you weren't quite sure if you had a job left, to a paternalistic more approach with a German company, Heidelberg. It was when I informed Citibank I was leaving, they said, why would you go to a printing? Printing's going to be dead in 10 years time. It proved that we had 10 good years with Heidelberg, but after the internet came along, we did see that the writing was on the wall with printing, and the market has declined since then. But when I first joined, Heidelberg was extremely profitable. we were doing acquisitions. We made acquisitions, which I was involved in, Linotype L, which was pre-press equipment. And that was based in Cheltenham, which I led. And then we also did the acquisition of our distributor in Asia. And it was after that acquisition is when I moved with Heidelberg as CFO for Asia Pacific to Singapore for 5 years.
You have had an exciting time, because you then went from there, where, to Germany, actually, was it? You were based in Germany.
Yes, I did 5 years in Singapore, and I covered China, Japan, Australia, and India, and all the countries in between. We had 1,000 employees, and it was $1 billion turnover. And that was the real highlight, or one of the real highlights of my career, because it was so varied, dealing with Japanese culture, Chinese culture, and even in the Philippines, where we were actually financing a press with the Catholic Church. They had an operation called Don Bosco, and they were actually developing training for street people to actually learn to become printers. And Heidelberg was investing in a press there. And we did want to be paid for the press, but the Don Bosco, which was a charity, said, we'll pay you with money we get, but we did want a letter of comfort. And in the end, I did manage to get a letter of comfort from the Cardinal of Manila, and his name was Cardinal Sin, which I thought was quite appropriate for a cardinal. But yes, I did 5 years in Asia, and then I was CFO for Europe, Middle East, and Africa, based in Heidelberg.
Yes, I can remember Cardinal Sin being quite a significant individual. I remember meeting a cardinal out in, I'm trying to think, well, that was in Singapore, or Hong Kong, perhaps it was. I can remember being introduced to him too. And you had to be quite sort of on the ball, of course, to be a Catholic leader in China, as it then became, of course, Hong Kong, because the relationship between the state and the church was always very fraught, and remains so, I think. So Heidelberg is, I always remember meeting a man called Herr Venus, spelled like Venus, who worked for Heidelberg, and he came across and to give us some help when we were trying to assist the Russians, the Russian church, in setting up printing. The problem was that in the car with me, I had Venus, who didn't speak any English, and the Russian, who only spoke French. And so he couldn't speak to Venus. And, so it went on. So I had, in my rather poor French and German, was trying to translate stuff backwards and forwards. That was my experience with Heidelberg. But were they one of the largest, or are one of the largest producers of printing equipment?
Yes, they are the largest in the world. They got about 45% market share. And in the UK, we had over 65% market share. So most magazines that you would read have been printed on a Heidelberg. Kellogg's cornflakes boxes printed on Heidelbergs. Almost all whiskey boxes are printed on Heidelberg. So and even to flyers that you'd get through the door would be on the basic Heidelberg. So the price range can be from around about 150,000 for a low-end press to around about £6-7 million. So if you're looking at the whiskey bottle ones, or whiskey boxes, their press is around about £7 million.
Goodness me. So, but you said that the market had dropped, but the number of novels, for example, published now is greater than it's ever been, and the number of, if you go to a bookshop, the choice is vast. So, how is it that the market has gone down?
Well, essentially, newspapers have gone down. Magazines, the amount of magazines that are printed have gone down. In the old days, every day you would open up your post and you'd have loads of leaflets from locals that would actually be local businesses that would be offering things. That's all gone down. So essentially, it's all of that. The printing that is not related to books has actually decreased significantly. When in 2000, Heidelberg UK had 10,000 customers. When I retired 2 years ago, almost now, we were down to 1,400 customers. So you could see how the market had consolidated and disappeared. The other thing was our presses were becoming more and more productive. And in the old days, when you were doing a printing job, you would have to be a qualified printer. You would actually start a print run. You would then print the work. You would then analyze it, change the inks, then do the print again. And then after probably 2 to 3 hours after, we'd call it make ready, the job would be ready for printing. That all changed. We de-skilled it. So when you actually start the printing process now, from pre-press, where you develop the plates, the ink profiles are sent to the press. The press automatically sets up the ink profiles. You press the button to start the job. And then there's something called impress control, which actually analyzes the work as it's going through, just to change the ink setting, all done automatically. And within 5 minutes, you're actually ready to start the printing job. So it's definitely de-skilled it, which is also one of the things that Heidelberg developed a significant amount of money on, just to make it much more productive. Because what we did find is that the customers that were left had to improve their productivity.
So you sort of were developing yourselves out of a job.
I always said, yes, we're almost like sitting on a branch and cutting it, because after 7 years, the technology had changed so much. You could take 2 presses out and replace them with 1 press. But then we started focusing more on the service side, because if you only had 1 press, you had to make sure that the spare parts were there the next day, that the downtime was limited. So we had a significant investment in our service side to make sure that there were never any problems with the presses. And you had things like remote diagnostics, where we could dial into the press and actually fix lots of the jobs remotely. So it come on significantly in the last 10 years.
Yeah. And yes, and did you make newsprint presses?
We used to own Goss, which was an American company. We took over Goss just in around about 1998, and they made newspapers. Well, they were a newspaper press, they printed newspapers, but we sold that business in 2004. Printing newspapers, the market just disappeared much quicker than anywhere else.
Yeah. Now, the really interesting thing is, I think, that you managed to persuade Heidelberg to be the first ever corporate member of the Stationers Company. Yes,
it was George Clark, my predecessor, and myself, that we agreed that it made a lot of sense to become the first corporate member of the company. And I think it was also, it was an initiative by William the Clark as well to do this. And we looked at it as there was a lot of benefits for us, in as much as that it included use of the hall that we could use, which we have used for entertaining our customers. It also allowed us to network, and there were a lot of interesting events that were there. And the other thing that we did as part of that is that it allowed us to get into the Innovation Excellence Awards, which Heidelberg have won twice. And so we've found it as a very useful thing to do. And you often underestimate, when someone first arrives at the hall, a lot of our customers were awestruck at just how wonderful it was and how related it was to printing. So having that link to a company like Heidelberg, who's still manufacturing printing equipment, it was always something that we found a very useful thing to be involved in. And from a livery company perspective, it keeps the livery company relevant to the current industries.
Well, relevant, and also it's financially helpful to us. So we're hugely grateful to you and to Heidelberg for that. And then just perhaps to conclude, you're the chair now of the foundation, Stationers Foundation. If you had a sort of dream, as it were, supposing we had a bit more money than we already had to give away, what would you like the foundation to do next?
Interestingly, we've just had our strategy discussion, and one of the things that we talked about in the foundation was what would we do if we had more money? Now, because we have limited resources, both from the trustees' time, etc., one of the things that we agreed that we would continue to do was do everything better with more money. So, for example, at the moment we're doing bursaries at 6,000. That we'd like to increase them to 9,000 and extend the range. We do Saturday schools and extend the range. But the other thing we all talked about was that the biggest losers during COVID have been the younger generation who can't get work experience. So what we would like to do and develop is actually utilizing the 1,000+ members that we have and working with 16 to 22-year-olds to try and get them placements within industry because or business, because most of the time when you're looking at someone's CV, what goes against them is that they don't have work experience. And if Heidelberg, sorry, if Stationers was the matchmaker between our members and also youngsters who wanted to get work experience, that would be something that we would like to develop.
Well, that sounds to me like a fairly good dream to keep in your minds in the hope that it'll be a reality, and a pretty good dream for us to finish our conversation. But thank you very much indeed, Gerard, for joining us and inspiring us, really. Thank you.
Thank you very much.